all of this energy we're spending on fighting for labor rights, at what point do we say like, oh, maybe we should be building something new instead of trying
Ugh.
to, improve our conditions on sinking ships? Like, I don't know the answer to that, but I think the point of this futures thinking is to ask these scenarios. And it's like, what would this look like? What would a professor owned university look like? And then start
Right.
building from there and imagining these things from.
Welcome to Tradition Breakers. I'm Mary Moses, former corporate executive turned creative entrepreneur. And each episode, I bring you an inspiring person or message to help more of us in the AAPI community break free from restrictive traditions that are preventing us from going after the life that we truly desire. Let's dive in. This episode is brought to you by Tasty Sounds, a company that I co-own, which helps bring experiences and brands to life through music. Whether you're throwing a private event, producing a retreat, or building a brand from the ground up, sound matters. It sets the tone, stirs emotion, and stays with people long after the moment ends. Tasty Sounds delivers curated DJ sets, custom playlists, and full sonic branding, all built to elevate your experience and help your audience feel exactly how you want them to feel. We don't just play music, we shape how people connect with your story. So if you're a founder, creative director, or just someone who knows the power of good music, head to tastysoundsla.com to book a consultation. Hi, Tradition Breakers. Welcome back. Today, I have a guest who is none other than Lee-Sean Huang. Did I say your last name correctly,
Yeah, you got it
Lee-Sean?
perfect on the first try.
Amazing. I've been practicing. Um, I'm sitting down with Lee-Sean, and I'm really excited to talk to him because he has a very unique role and I guess like what he does for a living, I've never come across before. So I'm really curious to learn more. Lee-Sean is someone who designed the invisible systems we move through every day. So think about all the ways that, we interact with a bank or a school or even your workplace, the people that you talk to, the website, the services that you get at a restaurant. There's someone actually that designs that. And we're speaking to him today. It's Lee-Sean. And so those experiences can either feel seamless, intuitive, even natural, or it can feel deeply disorienting or frustrating. So Lee-Sean's work lives in that space. He uses design thinking to center real human needs and redesign services, systems, and experiences that shape our everyday lives. So in this conversation, we hope to explore how he found his way into this kind of work, how his upbringing influenced his perspective, and what it means to use creativity as a tool for social change and better futures. Welcome, Lee-Sean.
Hi, Mary. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too, and you're welcome. So let's just dive right in. For those of us who are just hearing this for the first time, and I'm talking about your work, can you explain to everyone what you do so we can get like a more clear definition on what that also looks like in the real world?
Yeah, I am happy to. I feel like you did some great setup already with my introduction. So when I usually introduce myself to new people in a general context, I'll say that I wear three main hats. I'm an artist, a designer, and an educator. You've mostly talked about my design practice, so I can talk about that some more. I am a pretty holistic kind of designer known as a service designer. And so what that means is I'm looking at systems that run all of these experiences and these services that we interact with day to day. So just to give you some idea of some of the concrete projects I've worked on. I've worked with a genocide memorial in Rwanda. I've worked with a fintech startup in New York City, as well as with the New York City government on a different financial services project, which was how New York City residents were getting access to financial counseling and free tax prep services for people who qualified. And so the connecting thread with this, and then my primary job today is actually I'm the Co-Executive Director of AIGA, which is the Professional Association for Design, and I'm designing educational experiences, networking experiences for professional designers. But the connecting thread of
Mm,
all of that is thinking about a system, right? So
yeah.
as you were saying, just to give a concrete example, the financial services project I worked on when I lived in New York City was this financial counseling service. So it was a free service supported by taxpayers. Anybody who lives and works in New York City can call a number or go online, book an appointment with a financial counselor to talk about everything from, opening up your first bank account if you haven't done that already, to learning how to consolidate your credit card debt, your student loan debt, or building a budget for you and your
Mhm.
household. So it's learning all of these things. And so there's various touch points from how you even book your appointment to how do you find where your appointment is in person to the intake, right? Like how your counselor talks to you, how they learn more about your needs and delivers those services. So all of these things can be designed from like the flyers that you see at a social services agency to maybe the ads you see on the subway to the scripts
Mhm.
that the receptionist uses to help check you into your first appointment, right? So all of these things can be designed. And so that's what a service designer does is we look at this holistic system and then we might work with other specialized designers to design that, like a graphic designer for subway
Mhm.
ads to, somebody who's designing software for this service to all of these other touch points to the signage and all of these other physical things.
That's so interesting. See, I never knew that such a role existed. So it's really cool how you were able to explain that to all of us. A lot of your work touches everyday systems like I just mentioned and you just mentioned. Why is it important to design for how people actually move through these experiences?
Yeah. I think, really great image and example of this is what's called a desire path in urban planning. And so I saw this recently when I was visiting a library here in Providence, where I live now, where they had a desire path is essentially where you might have seen this, where it could be like grass between like a parking lot and a library or a store or something. And even though there isn't technically a sidewalk or path there, like people see the most logical way to go. And so they basically
Mhm.
make their own path, right? And so this is an example of where design happens, not just with the work of designers and architects and planners, but we're all shaping our world with this desire path in this case, right? Of people just walking on the lawn because
Right.
they see that as a more direct path. And so, as this relates to service design, we want to work with people. We conduct research, both qualitative, quantitative research to understand what consumers, what people who use services and products need, what they desire, but also see this as an iterative process of saying, like, okay, well, if this doesn't work, how do we change things? And so, a lot of it, when we were working on that financial counseling project in New York, was actually going to these centers where people were getting financial counseling, actually signing up as clients ourselves to talk about our own budgets, just to see what it's like. It was a little bit like
Yeah.
undercover boss in a way, right? Of like just
Yeah.
seeing what it's really like on the front lines of somebody experiencing a service.
Do organizations usually approach you after they have already launched a specific initiative and things might not be going as planned, or maybe that initiative isn't as well received? Or do they come to you initially before launching anything? Or maybe it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. In the case of that financial counseling project, the service had already existed since the
Hmm.
Bloomberg administration in New York. But other times it's somebody wants something new, right? We also worked with a founder of a fintech startup who was starting more with like an idea. She was more from the finance side of things, looking at alternative ways for people to get access to credit if they had what's called like a thin credit report, like maybe they're a new immigrant or they're married and they were like the non-working parent, or they were working at home, right, taking care of the kids, but they didn't
Hmm.
necessarily have an income from an employer where they could show, their financials and things like that. So from that, it was more like she had a model in a spreadsheet, and then we worked with her and her co-founders on building out what this would look like as an app. And so it's a little bit of both. I also do a lot of facilitation work where there's
Hmm.
teams and organizations who say they want to innovate in this space. They want to be more
Yeah.
human centered. They want to build something new, a new service, a new product. And so we work with them on like, okay, how do you do this? What is your research plan? And stuff like that. So sometimes it's the facilitation, sometimes it's the research part. Other times it's like creating something from scratch or tweaking something that already exists.
Yeah, I love what you said, human centered, which is great because you have the people in mind when you're creating and designing these experiences. How did you get to do this? What was like your trajectory like in terms of how you even thought about wanting to be a service designer or
Yeah.
at least integrating it into your work?
Yeah, I have a very windy path in terms of my professional and educational background. I actually studied political science at Harvard in undergrad because I was
Mhm.
interested in activism and political causes. Originally, I wanted to be a diplomat, actually. I was interested in international relations. I'm
Mm.
one and a half generation Taiwanese American. So I was born in Taiwan, but came to the US when I was 4 years old. So I was interested in like bridging cultures and people and stuff like that.
Mm.
Just kind of to fast forward a little bit, I got more involved in the creative side of activism and stuff like that, working in communications when I moved to New York City after college. And then from there, I was like, "Oh, there's this design thing that I'm more interested in." And
Mm.
so I went back to school. I did a master's at NYU in the program is called interactive telecommunications, which is a very opaque term, but essentially it was an art, design, and technology program. And so from there, I worked at a creative agency in New York and then started my own studio with my now husband, which is how I got into the service design work. And that's coupled with some of my academic teaching and research at the Parsons School of Design and at the School of Visual Arts in New York. So that's how I got involved in this holistically, or that's the short story. Happy to dive into more of the details too.
Yeah, thanks for that synopsis. That was really cool. And I love how you and your husband work together. Do you still work together with your husband to this day?
We still work together. So Fuso, which is the name of our studio, still exists.
Mhm.
Work out of our home now in Providence. We used to have a co-working space in New York when we lived
Yeah.
there, but it's not our primary job now. He's been working on some academic stuff at MIT, and I'm primarily working at AIGA these days as my primary job and teaching, but we still do some private commissions and projects like this. So recently we did a project where we were researching the experience of families, primarily parents, whose kids have cancer
Mm.
in the Chicago area and looking at the things outside of the treatment part of how they interact, but just things like, how do you coordinate with your friends and your family and your neighbors when they want to help you out, but you're overwhelmed, right?
Yeah.
All the things going on.
Yeah. What comes up for me is that the work that you do, whether it is through your individual consulting projects or with the organization that you're now have a full-time role in, is that community plays a large aspect, thinking about others, right? Caring about how others are experiencing certain situations or I don't know, experiences. Have you always been like that growing up? What has been your like upbringing?
Yeah. I feel like part of being that one and a half generation Taiwanese American, there's
Yeah.
this like, you feel this kind of tension or you feel the difference between maybe what's a more communal culture of being Taiwanese and then the dominant US American culture that can be more individualistic in a sense, right? And so,
Lee-Sean,
yeah,
before you keep going, do you
yeah,
mind defining for our audience what 1.5 generation is? I
yeah.
think that'll help them understand your point more.
Totally. Yeah, I think like first generation is usually like if you're an immigrant, which I am an immigrant, but usually that refers to folks who choose to be an immigrant as adults, like my parents who came over here for grad school in the early 80s. But being 1.5 generation means like I was already born when my parents decided to move to America. I was 4 years old. And so I didn't choose to be an immigrant, but I am an immigrant in that I was born in Taiwan, became an American later on. But all of my schooling was here in the US and in
Yeah.
English. So, I sound like I was born here, have dual citizenship, but like my Mandarin Chinese is like frozen in time. 6-year-old child, I think that's the experience where it's like you might be different than my parents where they still have an accent when they speak in English.
Yeah.
They sound like they're Taiwanese, but they've lived in America for more than half of their lives now.
Right. That's like my experience. I also moved when I was 4 from the Philippines. So completely, I totally resonate with what you're saying. So before I cut you off, you were talking about being in between two cultures.
Yeah, I think like experiencing that where I'm old enough to remember my early childhood in Taiwan. And my mom, in particular, is from a very large extended family in Taiwan. So there's a lot of, family events with like banquets. Like very seldom would
Yeah.
you just like go out to eat with your nuclear family, right? If you went to a restaurant, and this happens when we go back to visit our relatives, it'd be like a table of 12, one of those big round tables kind of things. And like just even things like meals, right? Like when you go to most American restaurants, Western style restaurants where you like order your own food and it comes in front of
Mhm.
you, right? It's like the food in a Taiwanese restaurant, Chinese restaurant, they put it in the middle of the table, the
Middle.
lazy Susan, right? And you share everything.
Yes.
So like that's just such a concrete example of like what a more collectivist culture is and a community centered culture is. And there's like trade offs and good and bad sides of it. Sometimes it's great, but other times it's suffocating because everybody's in everybody else's business, right? And so I
Right.
think having that experience and being able to navigate that has been a advantage in terms of like my point of view as an educator, as a designer, as an
Mm.
artist.
Yeah, because you can kinda go back and forth between your Taiwanese culture and then the American culture, and also just the greater immigrant culture, I think, right? You can
Totally.
kinda draw from that too.
Definitely.
In terms of your upbringing, how did that shape the way you design systems and think about people and power?
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot in that question to go with. I mean, I think thinking about power really comes from my political science background and being interested in that. You know, without going too much into the geopolitics, I think being Taiwanese, you're just very aware of that because of our neighbor, our bigger neighbor, China, and all of
Mm,
the sort of geopolitics around that, right? So you're just aware of the wider world. Whereas I think for a lot of Americans, you know, unless you're particularly interested in foreign policy or you have an immigrant background yourself, it's like the US is such a big country that there's just
yeah.
enough going on locally, domestically here. So there's that international perspective, but also I think seeing yeah, just the power dynamics of being that 1.5 generation immigrant child where like my parents speak fluent English. They did before they got here, right? They have master's degrees from US universities, but because it's not their first language, there is this kind of like power dynamic where you're the American, fully American educated child and helping with
Mhm.
things like, you know, proofreading a letter that your mom is writing, you know, for, I don't know, recommendation letter for an employee or something like that, where it's like, okay, well, you're the child, but your parents are still kind of not fully depending on you, but like kind of seeing you through that lens.
Mhm.
And so, you know, that power dynamic can change a lot. There's so many places I could go with this, but I feel
Yeah,
like
go there.
there in some ways because I grew up in Arizona in a primarily white community. So
Mhm.
um being the only time I was really around other Taiwanese Americans was at church on Sundays, but my school was like 98% white. And so I
How did
think
that feel for you with that? Did you find yourself like craving to see and be in community with other people who look like you? And then that experience with your mom, like helping her proofread, was that something that was sort of just like, oh, no big deal? Or did it create pressure for you as a child?
I don't think it created that much pressure. And I think this incident happened when I was like already like a teenager or something like that, right?
Got
So,
it.
I mean, I have heard of cases of people from immigrant backgrounds where like their parents speak very little English and then they're like 6 years old trying to translate for their parents, you
Yeah.
know, at a government like immigration meeting or something. Like that was not my case. You know, and in some ways, like my mom's English grammar is probably better than mine, right? She's just like asking
Right.
questions about usage and pronunciation and stuff like that. But yeah, at school, I mean, I definitely went through that phase of like being surrounded by my classmates who were primarily white and like
Hmm.
seeing, you know, they were the popular kids, right? I think in my
Hmm.
junior high, there was like one other, I went to a very small private school for junior high. There's one other Asian kid who was from an Indian American background, and pretty much everyone else was white.
Mm.
And so, you know, just even the like the beauty standards or the popularity standards were
Yeah.
all in a sort of white environment. You know, I don't think I really understood like Asian American identity until I went to college, where there were people who had grown up in much more Asian communities in like the Northeast or in California, where there was like a distinct Asian American
Yeah.
culture. I felt like it was, for me, it was like there was a Taiwanese culture at home and then
Yep.
like just a very white suburban American culture at school.
Yeah. Did you find it hard to connect with the other kids, or was it pretty much just easy for you?
I felt like I did well in school, so very stereotypically Asian in that way. And so I think I was liked by my classmates in that sense,
Mm,
but like I didn't play sports. I didn't like sports. I
mhm.
wasn't, popular in that sense. But also
Me neither.
my school was really small too for junior high. There were only like 45 kids in each grade. So everyone knew everyone else. It wasn't until high
Okay.
school where I moved to a different town. And so I didn't know anybody freshman year of high school at the public high school down the street from my parents' house, where it was like, oh wow, like where do I even fit in? Right. It's like I'm kind of a nerd, but I'm
Yeah.
also like musical and artsy. And so there's more like, how do I find myself in a much larger school since I'd been in such a small sheltered environment for junior
Yeah,
high?
what did you do? Did you join clubs and that's how you found friends?
I ended up like I was like involved in theater class and I did orchestra. I played piano, but I also took up cello so I could play in orchestra in high school. But since I just started cello when I started high school, like I was good enough to play with the orchestra, but wasn't like really good to be first chair or anything like that. I was like okay at theater stuff, but I played piano, so I could like play piano in some of the musical shows. So I
Mhm.
felt like I could be like part of these things, but not like fully in the center, right? I was definitely somebody who like didn't fit into one scene. It was like, oh, I was in honors classes, so I was with like the nerdy smart kids, but also with the artsy kids, but not like fully integrated into any.
Yeah. That's sort of like, it reminds me of your life right now in a sense where you're doing your design work, right? And then you are in a chorus, the gay man's chorus, correct
Yeah.
me if I'm wrong. And then you also are an advocate for justice, social justice. So you are still playing in these different arenas where you excel at too.
Yeah, I think, I call this like creative cross training in my
Mhm.
teaching and coaching, and basically drawn from the fitness world but applied to like other embodied creative skills. So this idea that like maybe you're a runner but you do yoga as like a recovery
Yeah.
thing or for your flexibility or whatnot, and so being a performer helps me in the classroom in terms of
Mm.
being on stage or speaking at a design conference, or the communication skills from being an educator helps with the advocacy work that I'm doing with labor union around academic labor and the precarity of that, which happy to talk about as well, right? So these things kind of
Yes.
connect with each other in terms of like skills from one area you can apply to somewhere else.
Yeah, so what seems to be unrelated are actually very related in terms of the skill sets that it requires.
Definitely.
So, going back to your experience, you're at Harvard, you're being exposed to other Asian kids that are there. Did you gravitate towards creating community with those kids, or was it something that I guess wasn't really resonating with you? How was that experience like in Harvard?
It didn't really resonate in the sense that like I maybe had different experiences, right? So it wasn't just
Mhm.
like, okay, we look similar and so we'll be friends, because I had mostly grown up around white people. And so there was also this thing of like, in some ways, I do fit some of these like Asian American stereotypes of being good at school and playing piano at a
Yeah.
stringed instrument. But in other ways, like I think compared to some of my Asian American peers, my parents were a little bit more hands off in terms of like they did not micromanage uh, my career choices and other things to the same extent that I saw some of my peers who were Asian American. And then I think there was an additional dimension to that being queer, and like not necessarily fitting in to a kind of
Mhm.
primarily straight Asian American culture. So yeah, there was like a lot of different things at play. And then there was just the initial culture shock of growing up in Arizona and then moving to the Boston area to go to college. And it was like, even though it's
So
still within
different.
the US, it's still just very, very different. Like my high school was kind of like the Beverly Hills 90210 high school, which will kind of date me in terms of age as well. In that, like, there was like definitely the popular kids. There was a girl in orchestra that played with us who was the harp player, and her parents bought her a Hummer for her 16th birthday,
Oh my goodness.
and like girls would like come back after summer break with like a different face because they got plastic surgery. So it was really like that. And then when I moved to the Boston area for college, I mean, there were plenty of rich kids at Harvard too, but
Yes.
the sort of Northeastern expression of that was just much more like guarded and like less like bling about it. So I didn't know like signals of like social class and how people like navigated those hierarchies. So I think there's just a lot of confusion at first of like, okay, where do I fit in
Yeah.
this pecking order, and like how are people signaling their backgrounds and stuff like that was just kind of opaque to me because I didn't really grow up with that.
Mhm. Yes, I feel like a lot of individuals experience that. I know I did where I was always assessing like who is everyone,
Mhm.
right? Like where do I fit into everything, especially since I moved around a lot as a kid.
Yeah.
And so I felt like I had to do that pretty often in my life and I got really good at it to this day. And there's negatives and positives to it. But for you, what are some of the challenges, I guess, that arose from that, if
Mhm.
any? And then overall, too, like what are some challenges that you face, whether it's external or internal, that really shapes who you are today?
Yeah. I probably didn't move around as much as you did, Mary, but I feel like one of the results of that is like you maybe takes a little bit longer to figure out who you are, right? Because you're
Yeah,
changing context. And I moved around enough or had these different contexts of like Taiwan to Arizona to Boston. And then, I also lived in Japan for a few years in my 20s, like studied abroad in Spain. So I like was traveling and experiencing different cultures and like not necessarily fitting in, but then the cumulative effect of that is like you do learn how to navigate difference, or like um it's like a muscle that you develop of like, okay, like by the third international move, you're like, okay, I can pick things up a little bit faster, whether it's learning a new language
right.
or just understanding these like unspoken cultural cues. But it
Yes.
speaks, it comes from that experience versus somebody who's maybe never left their hometown or never left their state.
Hmm.
Or their sort of dominant culture where they're comfortable. So there's maybe that like delayed, not maturity necessarily, but that delayed like being comfortable with yourself. But then the
Yep.
result of that is you do get the superpower of like once you are in a totally different environment, which I have been as in my design work and my research, where it's like, okay, I'm working with low income New Yorkers who speak Spanish as their first language, or I worked at this memorial in Rwanda with genocide survivors who experienced something that's totally unimaginable to my lived experience. But it's like, how do you empathize with them? How do you kind of understand where they're coming from? And so I think that builds that kind of empathy and just being able to navigate being an outsider, but still being able to connect somehow.
Yeah. Do you ever experience sometimes like maybe losing yourself temporarily
Mm,
because you're exposed to all these different groups and you have to adapt? I know sometimes I experience that where I'm like, huh, I'm doing this, but do I really want to do this or do I really want to present myself this way?
mhm,
Am I just doing this to make other people feel comfortable? And to your point, now I'm more aware of that. Whereas certain people who haven't moved as much as we have, perhaps they were made aware of that a lot sooner in their life. Like my husband, for example, he grew up in Minnesota um, throughout his childhood. And he is one of the most self-assured people that I know. Whereas with me, I consider myself still going through the journey of like really discovering and like putting my flag down in terms of how I want to present myself as and what I really stand for. Not saying that like I don't have any principles or beliefs and values, but I'm just finding that I'm still really navigating, like I said, how I want to really present myself regardless of where I am.
yeah. Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on that. One is just like having a multicultural, multilingual background.
Mm.
Right, there's, like, English-speaking me, which you all are getting now, but then, like, the Mandarin-speaking me is like a little kid, essentially, in a 40-something-year-old body in the sense
Oh
that,
my
like,
God, yeah.
I learned Mandarin growing up with my parents and relatives and stuff, but really I only used it in, like, a family background. Like, we went to Chinese school on Sundays, but, like, it's only 1 day a week, whereas you're in, like, American school for 5 days a week, and so by the time I was done
Right.
with, like, high school, we were still using like the Chinese school textbooks of like third graders or something in Taiwan, right? Because it's
Yes.
so there's like that kind of context where it's like I just haven't lived the same experiences in Mandarin that I have in English.
Mm.
And so like just different in terms of vocabulary and personality in that sense because it's like of a limited cultural context and social context. But then I think there's some other things about this where it's like there are just certain expectations of like what it means to be like competent or smart and a leader in like corporate organizational contexts that tend to favor like white men, right? In the US,
Mhm.
it's like, oh, are you assertive? Do you talk a lot in meetings and stuff like that?
Right.
And it's like, okay, I have a point of view. I'm pretty self assured now in my 40s, but I think I do have a tendency to like be quiet more upfront and listen more to like figure out
Same.
what is really going on before I
Mhm.
necessarily insert myself. And then I've had to sort of figure out in these, yeah, in work contexts, like, okay, well, sometimes I just have to talk for a more performative sense of like, okay, I'm still here, I'm paying attention, but I'm just like still trying to figure stuff out
I
rather than
know.
just like, oh, I have an idea now and like listen to me, you know? And so maybe there's like a
Right.
humility there, but then it gets like misinterpreted as like, you know, not smart or not a leader kind of thing.
Not
And so,
assertive.
yeah, so there's like all of these sort of things where it's like learning to understand what those codes are and sometimes being like, okay, this is not my choice to talk now, but I feel like I should talk now anyway.
Right. I hate that performative feeling. Like, oh, I have to say something because I haven't said anything and everybody else is saying something. I definitely experienced that in my work too. Being like the only woman and woman of color with a table of like C levels or VPs. And there was just white men like going at it. And I'm
Yeah,
like, should I say something now? So, but for me, it's like, why would I say something when I'm not ready yet? Because I want to contribute something valuable to the group if I do say something so that my voice is actually constructive, not just performative.
totally.
So that's where I feel like I'm still finding like what is the correct balance. Or maybe I'm like, fuck it, I don't care. Like I'm
Yeah,
just gonna do what I want.
totally.
And I'm not gonna like placate what you find to be assertive. But anyway, like with your work, I want to touch on future thinking
Yeah.
because I know that's a topic that you wanted to discuss today, and I want to as well. So, what does future thinking actually mean, and how do you use it in your work
Yeah.
and your whole entire breadth of work, not just in design, but also in activism and in the arts?
Totally. Yeah, I feel like futures thinking is something that is part of design, it's part of the arts, it's part of strategic planning in a company, it's part of politics, but it's not necessarily talked about in a systematic way. And what I mean by that is in order to make a strategic plan of like what your company is going to do in the next year, 2, 3 years, right? You have to have some vision of the future or futures. And that plural is really important. And with a designer too, it's like before a new product is going to launch into the world, you have to have an idea of like, oh, what is it going to look like? You can certainly like prototype it, mock it up, whatever the design work you're doing, but you also need to imagine like, what is it going to do? Not just in the marketplace in terms of like the financial performance, but like, how is it going to change the behavior or the habits of the people who use your product or whatever that is, right? And so
Right.
futures thinking is imagining these things. There's actually like an academic discipline called future studies. There was a professor named Jim Dador, who's one of the fathers of the field. And so
Mm,
sometimes it's associated with people who self-define as futurists, but I feel like that term has been a little co-opted by Silicon Valley in kind of like,
yes,
again, very like white
very
male
co-opted.
tech bro kind of ways. But really it means like, how do we collectively imagine different futures? And it could be behavioral stuff, cultural stuff of like, okay, how do we care for each other, take care of our communities in different ways, to the kinds of technologies and the tools that we use, and understanding what the trade-offs are, right? With like,
Yeah.
you know, the hot topic of AI. I was just talking to some to some contract and IP lawyers yesterday as part of my job at AIGA, thinking about like, oh, how do designers talk about AI when they're negotiating deals with their clients and stuff like that.
Right.
And one of them was like, yeah, we're just all figuring it out as we go along, right? Which I thought was a really
Yeah.
honest
Very
answer.
honest. Because it's true.
It's totally true, right? And we have like, on one hand, how do we find this place between like utopia and dystopia? Because that's usually where reality is. So we have like plenty
Mhm.
of dystopian sci-fi about like killer robots from Terminator to whatever. And then we have maybe have like some utopian visions like the Jetsons where we have like a robot maid and stuff like that. And then so
Yeah.
like we have these extremes from fiction, which is an important part of futures thinking. And then there's like, okay, how do we see ourselves or see our company, see our brand, and then think through different scenarios, right? Like, what does the day of the life look like working at your company 5 years in the future? Or what does the day in the life of one of your
Mm,
consumers look like? And then what are some driving forces? So these could be like trends in terms of like, is the government going to step in and regulate AI, or is it going to be the Wild West, right? And so you could
right.
build different scenarios based on the Wild West versus like a more regulated environment. Like there are known knowns and known unknowns, right? But you could think like, okay, well, if interest rates go up versus if they go down, that will affect investment in different ways. And so can you build out different scenarios that way? So it's like reimagining different futures and then saying like, okay, if it looks like we're going in this direction, we should do X, Y, and Z. So there's these kind of like if thens built in, and then this constant scanning of the environment where whether it's the
Constant.
regulatory, it's the economic, the cultural zeitgeist as well, right? I just saw
Yeah.
news of like McDonald's in Europe. I think the Netherlands put out this AI generated Christmas ad and they got bullied into taking it down. I see like this backlash where it's like, okay, people want to experiment with this new technology and incorporate it, but also there's like some taboos. And then it's like, okay, sometimes you just cross these invisible cultural lines and you get a backlash, right? And
Yeah.
that's part of navigating innovation.
Right. For me, what comes up is the importance of imagination because you really cannot be thinking about the future or have a futuristic mindset if you're not able to imagine and set aside time to actually daydream about these things, right?
Totally.
So that's really important. And sometimes I know that can be difficult, especially for people who are super busy, whether they're entrepreneurs or like 9 to 5ers. It's so easy to just get consumed in the work that you're doing now. But if you are a leader and if you are a founder, it's so important to be thinking about the things that you just discussed. And so with you, since you're like in the middle of all this constantly, what are some, I guess, future scenarios that you're seeing in addition to what you just shared with us with AI?
Future scenarios in like a particular area or just in
Yeah, it
general?
could be any area, maybe like in like activism or in business. Like what are you seeing in terms of trends that are like happening, maybe what we should be aware of?
Yeah. I mean, I can talk, maybe we can talk about some of the union work that I do
Yeah.
as the lens for this. So I'm an officer in the union that represents academic workers at the New School and NYU. I still teach at the New School, which is where the Parsons School of Design is located. I used to teach at NYU, but it's the same union for part-time professors and some graduate workers, as well as some student health services workers at the New School. And so and we're part of the UAW, which has been a great international umbrella union for us, but a lot of
Mm.
just the structures of how unions work are based on an industrial model, right? It came out of Detroit and the auto
Yeah.
industry, and it just assumes certain things of like, oh, you're even the language we use, like the shop floor was like the factory floor where you can like talk to your coworkers about
Mm,
working conditions. But when you're a part-time professor, you don't necessarily see your coworkers because you're just there on campus, you teach your class, and then you go to your other gigs. Or in my
right.
case, like I teach mostly online and like low residency in person because I live in a different city now. And so thinking about that, maybe one scenario is like, okay, how do we use technology beyond Zoom to build this culture? Like, what are the virtual spaces that we can create? But also, sometimes we have trouble with quorum when it comes to our meetings to make decisions as a union, right? And it's like, okay, well, it's hard when you have contingent workers who work evenings because classes happen in the evenings. Like, how do you schedule a time? Is there a way to time shift decision making so that we could, I don't know, vote online, but be able to verify people's identity, right? Or to debate issues
Mhm.
in a time shifted way that's asynchronous. So that's
Mhm.
one scenario of just like, how do we bring union organizing and decision making and structuring to the 21st century reality? Because a lot of that like operating system in the metaphorical sense is still based on this industrial 20th century model, right? So there's
Mhm.
that, but then with higher ed and all of the stuff going on there, maybe another future scenario is like, okay, well, what's the alternative? We have such a corporatized university in many contexts now.
Yes.
We have like all of these attacks from the administration politically, it
Mhm.
cuts in in funding. So it's like, okay, well, all of this energy we're spending on fighting for labor rights, at what point do we say like, oh, maybe we should be building something new instead of trying
Sure.
to, improve our conditions on sinking ships? Like, I don't know the answer to that, but I think the point of this futures thinking is to ask these scenarios. And it's like, what would this look like? What would a professor owned university look like? And then start
Right.
building from there and imagining these things from there. Or like even with one of the we're expanding to a new school for this union for part-time faculty, and so it's like, okay, well, what, even like negotiating this contract is an act of future making of like, okay, what do we want our working conditions to be, right? And what do people want? And some of it is like, okay, improving something in a linear sense of maybe like better pay or job security and more predictability in scheduling your classes. But we're in such a disruptive time with like
Very.
AI, with this like very uncertain funding environment, or this is a school that depends on international students too, who are sometimes afraid to come to the US now or can't even get visa uh, appointments, right? So like, what do you do there? Do we go back online and focus on that? Do you build a new model? Do we go build a campus in China? I don't know, right? But all of
Yeah.
these are like future scenarios to think through, whether you're management in a university or you're organizing in the union. It's like, how do we have a dialogue about these futures that affect the choices that we make today? So I think that's the thing maybe for your listeners as a takeaway is like, people are often busy just doing their day-to-day jobs and putting out fires, but it's important to talk about this, right? So we know it's ultimately we're talking about these futures and discussing and debating them so that they can affect the decisions we make now.
Yeah, yeah. Discussing and debating them. So after that process, discussion and debating them, how do we ensure that we're actually, um, I guess, using what we learn from all those discussions and debates, right? So they don't
Yeah.
just go, in the ether.
I think part of it is like, how do you make these futures concrete? Oftentimes a lot of this work as it relates to strategic planning and futuring, like they go into consultants' PowerPoint decks, right? And they get
Yes.
presented and then they get put away and filed away and forgotten about. But there's other techniques of making these futures more concrete. A couple of them that I use with my classes. One of them is just making something physical. I call this object from the future, where I just have the students like prototype something, some future invention. So there's like a physical thing. It doesn't work, obviously, but it's like a prop. But because it's a physical object, then we can talk about it, imagine what it does do, and then talk
Yeah.
about like, okay, how does this change the way that we work if this thingamabob exists? Right. So like having a concrete thing and not just like a PowerPoint deck is one way to do that. Another way is just to use storytelling. So another assignment that I have for my students is making a film about the future. We did one with my
Mm,
students at the School of Visual Arts last semester where they have essentially a half day to make a short film about the future. And so again, it's rapid prototyping, but it tells a story. So it contextualizes whatever that innovation is, whether it's like AI in the workplace or it's this object from the future. So it's not just the thing itself and the functionality, but it's like, how do people use it? How does it change people's behaviors? How does it structure people's relationships and power and hierarchy and all of these sort of things? So being able to tell stories and having like concrete examples is a way to bring stuff to life beyond just like a trends report or something that's more forgettable in terms
abstract.
of like
Yeah.
a slide deck.
Right. And it also, I think, speeds up adoption because storytelling is really powerful in that way. It allows people to share ideas a lot quicker because there's just a lot more, I guess, supportive material behind it, right? It's not just like stats or a presentation, not to knock presentations, but storytelling allows individuals to really understand a concept, I think, a lot better. And with story, it's a lot easier to share it too.
And it
So
brings
what
emotion
I'm
into it, right? Sorry to interrupt.
exactly. No, no, go ahead.
Yeah, that like sometimes with this futures work, it's like, okay, well, there is a quantitative aspect of it too, right? Whether it's like the business project, like the sales projections or, what we think the economic environment is going to be like. But then there's also the emotional one. Like, what does it look like? This isn't part of my work, but there was a story from a few years ago about this Russian computer scientist. They were like two friends. They were both like Russian engineers, and one of them died tragically young. and the
Mm.
surviving friend like essentially built a bot that was like trained on like all of the correspondence that these friends had had in life, so then this bot could like speak in the voice of her friend, right? And it's like, okay,
That's like
that's like
Westworld.
that, yeah, it's like her way of dealing with this, but then, like, for some people, it's like, that is creepy as fuck, right? And it's just like, okay, so it's like, how do you put this out there in terms of, like, having people experience, like, what would this be like in addition to, like, what is the business case for something like this? And so I think
Yeah.
it's important to bring in these things so people can, like, experiment with them and also test them, right? Because people are gonna, react in different ways, as we see with AI today, with, like, the
Oh,
McDonald's ad or whatnot. Like, some people are like, "Cool," and other people are like, "Hell no."
for sure, for sure. The emotional piece is huge because that's how we make decisions. I think we like to think that we're these logical creatures that's driven by logic and data, but really it's the emotional part of us that makes decisions even before we fully understand something. And what this reminds me of is that old documentary from I think Michael Moore,
Mhm.
was it? No, maybe not. But it's the guy who did Super Size Me, and he sparked a whole movement
When Morgan
around.
Spurlock was the super
There you go. Yes.
the guy who ate at McDonald's, right, for, like, a month or something.
Yes, exactly. So he created, like what you said, he turned his idea into something concrete, which is the documentary that people are able to really understand. It caused emotion, and it really did manifest into an actual, physical and systemic change. Yeah. What projects or ideas are you currently working on right now that you're excited about?
Yeah, I'm the professional front at AIGA. We're the Professional Association for Design. We're the oldest professional association for design in the US. It was founded back in 1914. So we're going through just some strategic planning at the moment. So also thinking through like, what does it mean to be a membership organization in this day and age? It's funny because I went to a online conference last month about like the future of community, and a lot of brands are talking about this, like not just like how do you
Oh.
monetize community, but how do you do this? And I was like, I thought it's pretty funny because the AIGA community is like over 100 years old. We have our own challenges in terms of like people maybe want to do things, they want to like buy a course or they want to come to a conference, but like fewer people want to like sign up to be a member in isolation, right? So it's like
Mm.
there's definitely this generational shift of like people want to do things collectively, but they don't necessarily want to join things. And so, how do we make sense of this paradox, right? And so, a lot of this is just thinking of that through of like how do we exist as a community in the digital age when there's other places where community can exist. And so that's one of the big professional things I'm working on. There's the ongoing labor union stuff that I'm organizing. And then personally as well, I'm just getting back into music. So you mentioned earlier, I do sing with the Rhode Island Gay Men's Chorus here in Providence, but I also am getting back into just like making my own music and like finding the joy in that of like playing piano or writing songs and stuff. I'm not quite sure where that's going to go, but I think again, as it relates to creative cross training, right? It's like, okay, the
Yes.
music that I'm doing for myself, I might post online at some point, or it might just be for myself, but it will just help how I show up in other places in terms of, confidence or the ability to improvise in the moment. I mean, this podcast interview was an improv in a sense, just like
It is.
a jazz solo might be, right? So we're like riffing off of each other. It's a collaborative thing. So yeah, those are the things that I'm doing like creatively and professionally at the moment.
That sounds so fun. The community thing is fascinating to me. So I'd love to hear an update from you on that. And I didn't know that it was becoming a lot harder, at least for your organization, for people to join. Is it because I guess the trend right now, especially amongst young people, is like, I guess, low commitment? Like there's so many things that they can join, the swipe culture, that it's hard for people to really like hunker down and make that commitment?
I think we're competing with a lot of newer communities where the barrier to entry is less, right? Because like you can come to AIG events as like a member of the general public, as a designer, or as a member, and members get a discount. But there's the idea of like, okay, paying to be a member versus like showing up to one thing versus like joining a Slack group for queer designers or for Asian American designers
Mhm.
or whatever that doesn't necessarily have an entry fee into it, or like being on LinkedIn, right? So we're competing with all of these other spaces online and in person. And so I think there's a little bit of that as well, but there's also it's the result of less gatekeeping in a way, right? There's like the industrial model of how you became a designer in the 20th century, and now you might have gone to design school, or maybe you learned on your own on YouTube, and then you just started doing freelance work and built out your portfolio that way. So there isn't just one way to be a designer today, and so you're not necessarily encountering AIGA from going to design school, right? And so if you
Yeah.
are self-taught, you maybe never encountered us before until later on in your career.
Yeah, so I'm hearing there's a lot more competition in a sense, since there's so many more communities out there that people can join that have lower barrier to entry. And then I'm also hearing that the process has changed, right? In
Totally.
terms of what it looks like to enter that profession. And so it sounds like it's causing you all to re-examine like what can membership look like.
Yeah, definitely. And like
Yeah.
co-creating that with our members too, right? So it's like
Yeah.
that's the other thing. It's like, okay, you're paying dues to be a member, but also we're asking you to volunteer your time, your creativity, and do that. But it requires like trust and dialogue, and like how do you set up those conditions?
Yeah, for sure. And then with your other project, with your music, are you playing with like any AI tools in music that have recently come out, like music production?
I haven't done like any of the like soup to nuts things because it still creeps me out a little bit, but I haven't like, for example, like in a recent song that I wrote, I like mostly wrote it, but I've been like I would use Gemini or ChatGPT to be like, what do you think about these lyrics? Or help me like
Yeah,
figure out this rhyme scheme. So it feels like more of like a dialogue in terms of writing. But in terms of like the actual musical part, it's still like me on a piano or on a ukulele figuring out chords. But more and more, there's like with Logic Pro, which is one of these music production softwares that exist out there. You can like have an AI generated bass line or drum track
hmm,
or something like that, which is great because I don't play bass or drums, right? So it's like
right.
it allows you to at least make a demo much faster and it decreases the barrier to entry. So I'm still experimenting myself, but I'm also old school in other ways.
Yeah, that sounds fun too. My husband is a musician as well.
Oh, cool.
He does a lot more music production for house music
Mhm.
because he's also a DJ. And he's recently using Sonos. And it's
Okay.
just so incredible, like watching him with the creative process, because for him, he uses it as sort of like you said, like a creative partner and almost like even a collaborator so that it's faster for him to kind of listen to how things can sound. So, not necessarily like replacing the creative work, but more like, I guess, quickening it to get it to
Totally.
that place where he wants it. And then also it like presents even different options that he might not have even thought about. Like what could this sound like with an Afrobeat type of vibe
Yeah, yeah,
versus,
definitely.
like R&B. So it's really cool. And I'm really curious as to how it's going to be received by the larger audience. Um it I'm seeing we're both seeing like AI artists like being on Billboard charts. So I'm like,
Wow.
huh, I wonder how
Yeah.
that's going to be and how people are going to react to that in the industry. Music has always been sort of like against technology, like we've seen with like Napster back in the day
Yeah.
or right?
But even before that, there was like controversy. What was that Bob Dylan movie that Timothée Chalamet was in earlier this year or last year?
Yeah,
And there was like when Dylan like switched from an acoustic guitar to an electric guitar at the
right?
Newport Festival, right? Folk festival, and then people were like, "Oh wow, this even folk music, right?" And so there used to be all of
Yes.
these arbitrary kinds of rules, right?
Right.
Like going electric was like a taboo. So I think we're seeing that now with AI. And I think so much of it is like, how do you find that balance between like the human and the technological in this? I think it's maybe like there's like the lazy version of like, oh, just put something, put a prompt in and get an image or get a song. But the
Yes.
reality is like, okay, there's something else. It's like, what is the human contributing? What is the AI contributing? And how does that final
Yes.
product like still have a human soul, but it's enhanced in some way, right? Or allows like
Right.
people who don't have classical training in music to also make music, which I think is a good thing.
It is a good thing, yeah, and I know that that's obviously, like, the ideal way that we as humans use AI or should use AI, but You can't really control what everybody does. I think the last question that I'll ask you to close us out, and I usually ask this in the beginning, but I want to try something different with
Okay.
you,
I'm
which is
happy to be a guinea pig for this.
makes you a tradition breaker?
What makes me a tradition breaker? I think the main thing I'll say is like being someone who's like chosen my own path career-wise and basically putting together a portfolio career. So I do have a primary job now, but I also have my teaching, I have like my private design practice, I have my artistic practice, and like rather than thinking about them as like just a binary of like day job and artist, which has been around for a while, is like they're all integrated in some way. They like relate to each other. And I think there's going to be more and more of that, right? Because of just the way that employment works today, the economy works today, but also people wanting to have balance and integration and control. So it's very different from my parents who ran their own business, their computer store for their whole careers, and then retired. So I
Yeah.
think it's like that's kind of the tradition that I'm breaking and responding to the environment that we're in.
Oh, I love that. So do you see yourself then as designer, creative thinker, and then all the different applications under that are your work?
Yeah, definitely. Whether it's like a photo project that I do, which we didn't even talk about that, to like the songs that I write, like they're all kind of based on my lived experiences from like the travel that I've done as a designer, as a design researcher, to the designers that I talk to and plan events for at AIGA. It's like all of this, right? I feel like artists need to have lives so that they can make work that
Yes.
responds to that. And so that's just like integrating all of these things, but also being able, singing with a chorus or doing improv also helps me host a design conference, right? So all of these are
Yes.
interrelated in that sense of like, what is your holistic portfolio career, which is maybe different from like having a totally unrelated day job and then playing your music at night or whatever, which is, what people have to do to survive as well. So I'm not
Yeah.
knocking it, but I'm just trying to show some of the distinctions maybe of what a portfolio career might look like
Oh,
versus,
yeah.
yeah,
I'm glad that you said that because sometimes it seems like people with 9 to 5s get knocked as like, oh, you're not, like as serious about your craft or whatever if they do have something else that they're doing. And I totally don't believe that. I think that everyone has their own way that they want to manifest the type of life that they want to live. And it's healthy to have, like you said, different sources of income, different projects because of how the world is changing right now. So if you're listening to this and you're kind of thinking about creating another type of lane for yourself, like don't feel the pressure to have to quit your day job right away.
totally.
You totally can do both for forever or for a specific period of time.
I would also say like this integration has worked for me, but I know for some other people, like they want to keep things separate. Like I have a friend who's a filmmaker, that's his main creative thing, but his day job is essentially tutoring wealthy children on their like SATs and their college stuff.
There you
But for him,
go.
it gives him the income, the flexibility, and like he gets to keep his creative powder dry for the film work, right? And so that
Yes.
works for him. So I think for our listeners, like think about what works for you. For me, it's like this
Yes.
more integrated model, but for other people, it's like, okay, you have what you make money doing, and then there's like that gives you the time and the space to do the other stuff.
Yes. And the only way you really know what works for you is by doing it and trying it out. That's it.
Totally.
I think that's a great way to end this. Thank you so much, Lee-Sean, for your time and for chatting with me. And thank you, everybody, for joining us again this week. We will talk to you, or I, not Lee-Sean, but I will see. I'll see you on the next episode. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Mary. Bye.
If you like this episode, consider subscribing, sharing, and leaving a rating and review. Tradition Breakers is produced by Tasty Sounds, and the theme music is by DJ Professor Moses.